Stories, Philippines, podcast.
Have you ever sat in a room that felt too heavy, a room where the air itself seemed thick with unspoken secrets, where the shadows weren't just the absence of light, but the residue of countless eyes watching, waiting? Imagine that room not as a dusty attic or a forgotten cell, but as the seat of national power, a house built to reflect a nation's highest hopes, yet now arguably haunted by its deepest wounds. It's a place where lavish banquets were held while millions starved. A place where decisions affecting entire generations were made, often in the dark, whispered hours of the night. It's a structure that has witnessed colonialism, revolution, and the intoxicating, corrosive effects of absolute authority. What happens when the weight of history becomes too great for the walls to bear? Do the ghosts of those who governed, and perhaps misgoverned, truly remain? Do the spirits of the oppressed linger in the hallways of their oppressors? Tonight, we pull up a chair to a table set for a feast that never truly ends. A gathering of the living and the dead in the most significant official residence in the Philippines. I am Paul, and you are listening to Stories Filipinas podcast, The Weight of History and the Empty Chair, the Palace. The name alone conjures images of grandeur, power, and often controversy. In the Philippines, that name is Malacañang. Nestled on the northern bank of the Pasig River in the capital, Manila, the structure is more than just an official residence. It's a living museum of the nation's tumultuous journey. The building's origins trace back to the late 18th century, specifically 1750. It wasn't initially a seat of government, but rather a summer house for an affluent Spanish merchant, Don Luis Rocha. The site itself, with its proximity to the cool river breeze, was seen as a respite from the walled city of Intramuros. The architecture was classic Spanish colonial, heavy on stone and wood, built to withstand the tropical climate and the occasional earthquake. Imagine the original structure. Thick adobe walls, high ceilings, large capichel windows letting in a milky, diffused light. It was an escape, a quiet retreat. That peace, like so many things in the Philippines, was short-lived. By the 1800s, the property had been purchased by the Spanish colonial government. It transitioned from a merchant's estate to the official residence of the Spanish Governor-General after the 1863 earthquake severely damaged the original governor's residence in Intramuros. This moment marks its true birth as the center of colonial power, a pivot point that changed its spiritual and possibly its spectral character forever. From then on, the Palace has been a silent witness to a parade of rulers: Spanish governor-generals, American military governors, Commonwealth presidents, and finally, the presidents of the Republic. Each administration brought its own ambitions, its own scandals, and its own unique shadow to the place. This constant, high-stakes political turnover, this continuous cycle of hope and betrayal, victory and loss, may well be the engine that fuels the persistent paranormal activity reported within its walls. The 1980s and 90s in particular saw the palace become a symbol of both extreme opulence and profound political trauma, especially under the Marcos and subsequent administrations. The stories from that era are not just political history. They are deeply human tragedies played out on a grand stage. Imagine the psychological toll of living in a place where your every move is scrutinized, where you know the fate of millions rests on your decisions, and where the air is thick with the knowledge of past atrocities and current corruption. This intense psychological pressure cooker is a breeding ground for powerful, lingering energies. Ghosts of Governance Global Connections. The idea of a haunted presidential or royal residence is not unique to the Philippines. Across the globe, seats of power are often rumored to be filled with the dead. The White House in Washington, D.C. has its famous sighting of President Lincoln. Holyrood House in Scotland is reportedly haunted by the ghost of David Rizzio, Queen Mary's secretary, murdered brutally in her presence. The Tower of London is a notorious spectral hotspot filled with the ghosts of executed nobles and even children. What connects these places is not just their age, but their purpose. These are not just homes, they are crucibles of history. They are places where life-altering power was wielded, often violently. When a place is the site of repeated, high-intensity emotional events, such as state-sanctioned execution, political betrayal, or overwhelming public grief, that emotional energy is believed by many to embed itself into the very structure of the building. Filipino cultural beliefs amplify this idea. We have a concept called pamana, which roughly translates to legacy or inheritance. It suggests that what the ancestors do, the living inherit, not just in terms of wealth or reputation, but also in spiritual responsibility. When applied to the palace, this suggests that the sins and secrets of the past rulers are literally inherited by the building itself and by the present occupants. Malacañang is thus burdened with the pamana of every act of governance, good and bad, creating a spiritual debt that manifests as restless spirits. One persistent account involves a particular section of the palace near the formal dining hall, specifically the area where the Council of State would meet. It's here several staff members over the years have reported that they encounter a subtle yet chilling anomaly: an empty chair at a long table, often perceived to be slightly warmer or colder than the others, or sometimes even pushed a few inches from the table, as if someone just abruptly rose from it. The sensation is not of a malicious presence, but of an unfinished discussion, a decision left perpetually hanging. One staff member, who we'll call Jamina Rosales, worked in catering during the late 1980s. She described her experience as she was setting the table for a small, unpublicized dinner. The air was already cold, Jemian recalled, her voice a low whisper. Even years later, it was the usual air conditioning, but somehow heavier. I was counting the silverware, and I came to the seat closest to the ventana overlooking the river. The chair was pulled out, not much, maybe half a foot. I pushed it back in, assuming the day crew had been careless. When I turned to place the water pitcher, I heard a sound, not a scrape, but a kind of sigh. And the chair was out again. I looked up quickly. I swear I saw the briefest impression of a man's hand resting on the dark wood of the table, just for a second before it vanished. It was a large, strong hand, not the hand of a servant. I didn't wait. I simply backed out slowly and didn't mention it to anyone, fearing they'd think I was disturbed. This ghost, often described as a tall, formal man in a dark suit with an air of profound authority, has been linked to several past inhabitants, from American governors to influential Philippine presidents. He is the ghost of unfinished business, representing the enduring cycle of Philippine political drama, forever sitting in council, unable to leave the seat of power, and the consequence of his action. He embodies the burden of the empty chair, always present at the table of the nation's feast. And remember, if you have your own stories of the strange and unexplained from the Philippines, whether it's an encounter with a local folk creature or a personal brush with history's shadows, we want to hear them. Submit your stories at storiesphilippines.com. Your experience might be the next one we share. Folklore and the Tikbalang guards. To truly understand the spectral residents of Malacañang, we must look beyond mere political history and into the rich tapestry of Filipino folklore. The location of the palace near the Pasig River is significant. Rivers and large bodies of water, in traditional Filipino belief, are often considered boundaries or highly powerful spiritual territories. They are the domain of nature spirits or diwata, and darker, more powerful beings. The Tikbalang is perhaps one of the most compelling mythological figures relevant to the palace. This creature is described as a tall, humanoid entity with the head and feet of a horse. It is a trickster, often leading travelers astray, causing confusion, and is believed to guard sacred or powerful places, especially large, ancient trees. While the grounds of Malacañang have changed, large old trees, specifically balete trees, which are sacred to the Tikbalang, were historically and are still present on the extensive property. In some Filipino folk traditions, the tikbalang can also be linked to excessive wealth and power. It is said that a tikbalang can be compelled to serve a human who manages to tame it, often by getting it to wear a special bridle. However, that service often comes with a terrible price, a Faustian bargain where the human's desires are met but their spiritual life is corrupted. There are whispers among older groundskeepers, men who have worked the property for decades, that the power surrounding the palace isn't solely political. They say that the immense authority and the almost impenetrable security around Malacañang is not entirely physical. They believe a tamed tikbalang, or a powerful nature spirit, was somehow bound to the grounds long ago, perhaps by a governor-general or an early president who sought power beyond mortal means. The creature's job would be to guard the seat of power, not just from physical intruders, but from those who might try to overthrow the ruling power through magical or spiritual means. These stories often emerge in descriptions of the palace's security perimeter. There are numerous anecdotal reports from the 1980s and 1990s from security personnel whose names will change to Rafael Hozon and Arturo Reyes, who worked the night shift patrolling the riverside walls. They spoke of inexplicable confusion, a sense of being turned around in familiar paths, and the sound of heavy, galloping hooves on pavement where there were no horses, always heard near the oldest part of the wall by the river. It wasn't a car, Rafael recounted during an interview in the early 2000s. It wasn't a jeep or a bicycle, it was the sound of a beast, a heavy, fast beast, and the moment I heard it, I forgot where I was supposed to be. I was looking for the gate, but I was walking in circles by the old mango trees. It was like a thick fog had entered my mind. When I shook it off, I was back near the river, facing the wrong way, and the hoofbeats were gone. It was a warning, a clear sign we weren't alone in guarding that house. This supernatural guardian serves as a perfect cultural parallel to the security and secrecy surrounding any seat of power. It represents the invisibility of true influence, the power that exists beyond public scrutiny, the agreements made in shadow, and the spiritual cost of absolute authority. The connection between the tikbalang and the palace speaks to an international parallel as well, the concept of sacred kingship or divine right. In many ancient cultures, the ruler was not just a political leader but also a religious or magical figure, and their residence was considered a spiritually charged zone. The tikbalang is the Philippine manifestation of that idea that the authority of the palace is not just based on a written constitution but also on a powerful, otherworldly pact. Modern investigations and spectral residents. In the late 1990s, a small independent group of local Filipino paranormal investigators, led by a former professor we'll call Dr. Elena Santiago, was granted highly restricted, unofficial access to a few select areas of Malacañang. Their goal was to use modern equipment to test the decades of staffed rumors. The team focused their initial efforts on the presidential study and the ceremonial hall, areas known for high emotional energy and numerous historical events. Their tools were standard for the time: electromagnetic field meters or EMF meters, digital voice recorders for electronic voice phenomenon or EVP, and thermal cameras. Their findings, though never officially released and subject to the usual debate over paranormal evidence, were striking. In the presidential study, particularly around the large antique desk, the EMF readings consistently spiked to levels far exceeding normal electrical interference, even after all non-essential power had been temporarily shut off. According to Dr. Santiago's private notes, the spikes were not constant, but pulsated, like a rapid irregular heartbeat, especially between the hours of 2 o'clock and 4 o'clock in the morning. The most compelling piece of evidence, however, came from the Ceremonial Hall, the scene of grand balls, state receptions, and significant political announcements. The area is large, ornate, and known for the empty chair phenomenon. During an EVP session conducted late one night, the team left a recorder running in the hall while they were monitoring another room. When they reviewed the audio, they found a brief, chilling segment. Amidst the white noise, a clear, disembodied whisper was captured. The voice, identified by an audio specialist as an older male, seemed to be saying two distinct words: "It is empty." The interpretation of this is profound. Is it a comment on the physical empty chair? A confirmation from the spectral resident? Or is it A far more devastating assessment, a ghost's reflection on the moral emptiness or hollowness of power in that very seat. Beyond the ghost of unfinished business, staff and security have long spoken of another, more tragic figure, the weeping lady of the balcony. This female apparition is most often seen on the second-floor balcony overlooking the river. She is described as wearing a simple white or cream-colored barotseya and is always seen with her head bowed, weeping silently. This figure is believed to be the spirit of a domestic helper, or perhaps the secret mistress of a powerful man from the early 1900s. The story, passed down through generations of household staff, suggests she was heartbroken or wronged by someone in authority, perhaps pregnant and abandoned, or abused and silenced. Her ghost is a powerful symbol of the invisible victims of the palace's power, the people whose lives were broken by the immense authority housed within those walls, their suffering hidden behind the opulent facade. Her silence is her testimony, a constant sorrowful presence that reminds the living that the palace has always been a place where the powerful hold sway over the powerless. The Weeping Lady is a classic example of a residual haunting, an emotional imprint repeating a moment of deep sorrow. But for the staff, her presence is much more. It's a moral compass, a silent indictment of the historical arrogance and cruelty of the powerful who have resided there. It's a reminder that even in the highest halls of power, there are always victims. The science of haunting and psychological context. The scientific and psychological community offers several counterpoints to the purely paranormal explanations. We must consider the power of suggestion, especially in an environment as historically and politically charged as Malacañang. The structure is one of the most photographed and talked about buildings in the country, a site of continuous controversy and high drama. If you work in a place steeped in so much tragedy and rumor, you are primed to interpret any anomaly, a creak, a shadow, a fluctuation in temperature, through a supernatural lens. The concept of infrasound is another crucial scientific tool used to analyze reported hauntings. Infrasound refers to low-frequency sound waves below the range of human hearing, often produced by natural phenomena like high winds, earthquakes, or by large electrical or mechanical equipment. These inaudible waves can have profound psychological effects on humans, including generating feelings of fear, anxiety, and a sense of presence. They can even cause physical symptoms like eye vibrations, which can make people perceive shadows or movement in their peripheral vision. The palace, being an old structure situated near a river and housing extensive aging mechanical systems and generators, is a perfect candidate for infrasound generation. The constant low hum of the city, the river traffic, and the building's own machinery could be creating the physical sensations that staff interpret as a ghost. However, the psychological dimension is perhaps the most compelling. Living and working at the center of political power imposes an almost unbearable psychological burden. You are constantly surrounded by high-stakes decisions, whispers of corruption, and the knowledge of the nation's profound problems. The collective psychological stress of the palace's occupants, past and present, is immense. A phenomenon known as place memory suggests that highly traumatic or emotionally intense events can leave an energetic or psychological imprint on a location. It's a non-supernatural explanation for residual haunting. The walls of Malacañang have absorbed the fear of coup attempts, the paranoia of political betrayal, the crushing guilt of corruption, and the hubris of absolute authority. For staff members who often come from humble backgrounds and are daily exposed to the extreme opulence and moral complexity of the ruling class, this psychological environment is magnified. They are the unseen witnesses. Their subconscious minds might be projecting the historical trauma they know and feel into the environment, manifesting as the empty chair or the weeping lady, figures that symbolize the palace's moral cost. The ghosts, in this view, are not necessarily distinct entities, but rather psychological manifestations of the palace's history and the conscience of the people who inhabit it. This is a story about the intersection of history and belief. We want to know your thoughts. Do you believe these are true specters, or is it the profound psychological weight of history? Find show notes and support options in the description. Your contribution helps us keep the microphones open and the stories coming. Theological insights and the burden of sin. From a theological perspective, the haunting of Malacañang can be interpreted through the lens of moral consequence and justice. The Philippines is a deeply religious nation, and the concept of sin and redemption is central to its cultural framework. The Catholic faith, which is predominant, teaches of purgatory and the possibility of restless souls who are unable to find peace due to unconfessed sins, unresolved worldly attachments, or acts of grave injustice committed during their lives. The ghosts of Malacañang, particularly the spectral man of authority, can be seen as souls eternally bound to the site of their greatest worldly sin. This isn't about mere haunting. It's about spiritual debt. A ruler who commits an act of corruption, who allows his people to suffer while he indulges in a palatial feast, creates a moral imbalance, an act of injustice against God and his people. The spiritual consequence of this act may be so heavy that his spirit is tethered to the place where that injustice was executed. The empty chair is not just a reminder of an unfinished political council, but a spiritual trial that the ghost is eternally forced to attend, unable to escape the judgment of his past. Furthermore, in Catholic theology, there is a concept of communal or generational sin. This idea suggests that the negative spiritual effects of historical injustices can linger and affect the living. The long, bloody history of the palace, from its colonial origins to its association with authoritarian rule, has generated a massive amount of historical sin. The building itself becomes a spiritual vortex where these collective sins of power manifest as paranormal disturbances. The weeping lady in this context is the voice of the oppressed, a symbol of the innocent who are crying out for justice that was never served in the temporal world. International theological parallels abound. In medieval Europe, cathedrals and royal courts were often subject to stories of demonic influence or haunting by damned souls, especially when the ruling class was perceived as corrupt or tyrannical. These narratives served a dual purpose. They were cautionary tales for the powerful and a source of comfort for the oppressed, suggesting that even if worldly justice failed, divine judgment was inevitable. The recurring theme of the empty chair aligns perfectly with the theological concept of unworthiness. The ghost is perpetually present, but perpetually absent from true peace or power. He is a damned figure who cannot truly sit at the feast of the living because he is burdened by the spiritual cost of his earthly power. The palace, in this religious framework, is a physical space that is spiritually compromised. It needs not just a new administration, but a spiritual cleansing, a massive act of national repentance to break the cycle of historical injustice and lay the restless spirits to rest. Geographic details and the Pasig River. The physical geography of Malacañang Palace is integral to its paranormal reputation. The palace is located on a sweeping bend of the Pasig River, a waterway that historically was Manila's lifeblood but is now also a symbol of environmental and societal neglect. The river's role is critical. In Filipino folklore, rivers are powerful, moody, and deeply connected to the spirit world. The Pasig, with its dark, sluggish current, has seen centuries of history, Spanish galleons, trade boats, and tragically, the disposal of bodies during periods of conflict and authoritarian rule. It is a massive, emotional memory keeper. The palace's walls run right up to the riverbank, and the windows offer views of the polluted yet historically significant water. This proximity creates a spiritual bridge between the palace's indoor, controlled environment and the vast, untamed, and often tragic energy of the outside world. Many accounts from the staff note that the activity is strongest during the evening tide changes on the river. This phenomenon suggests that the ghosts might be tethered not just to the building, but to the fluid energy of the river itself, a kind of constant, moving towards the threshold between the world of the living and the spirit realm. The old gate facing the river is especially notorious. This gate, now rarely used, was a key point during colonial times, allowing the Governor-General to escape or arrive discreetly via water. It is a place of transitions and secrets. Staff have reported seeing the spectral figure of a man in a long, tattered coat. Not an official, but perhaps a messenger or a spy, materializing near the gate before quickly dissolving into the shadows. This figure represents the flow of clandestine information and betrayal that has always characterized the palace's history. The entire palace complex is actually a collection of buildings, manicured gardens, and historical trees, creating a dense, layered environment. The sheer size of the grounds, shielded from the public eye, allows for a feeling of deep isolation and secrecy, even in the middle of a bustling city. This isolation, the constant sense of being observed only by the historical walls and the silent, ever-flowing river, intensifies the psychological impact of the place. The historical context of the land is also important. Before the Spanish built their house, the area was likely a traditional settlement or a clearing used by local communities. The genius loci, or the spirit of the place, may have been disturbed by the imposition of a foreign, colonial seat of power. The very foundation of the palace may rest on a spiritual imbalance, a wound in the land itself that has never fully healed. The ghosts, in this light, are not just the dead of recent history, but the angry, ancient spirits of the land protesting the seizure of their territory by centuries of foreign and domestic elites, crafting authentic Filipino characters. The stories of Malacañang are given voice by the people who work there, the unseen hands that maintain the seat of power. They are the true keepers of the palace's spectral secrets. Let's meet two individuals whose names have been changed to Crisanto de la Cruz and Evelina Ramos. Crisanto de la Cruz, in his early 40s, worked as a palace security officer for over a decade, starting in the early 1990s. He is a quiet, stoic man from Pampanga, a province known for its strong culinary traditions, but also its history of resilience and political struggle. Crisanto's presence is solid and unremarkable, which is precisely why he was so valued for a high security post. Crisanto's most profound encounter was not a visual ghost, but a direct, unsettling auditory experience in the East Wing, which houses many of the private quarters. One night, while doing a routine check, he heard the faint but unmistakable sounds of a child crying near a long-closed nursery. The sound was distinct, not the cry of a current resident's child, but something thinner, older, and deeply forlorn. When he checked the security log, he realized the wing had been completely empty since midnight. The sound stopped the moment he approached the door. Crisanto believes the child is the ghost of lost innocence, representing the young lives and ideals sacrificed to the machinations of power. He never speaks of it, but the memory sits in his eyes, a permanent shadow. Evelina Ramos, a house manager in her late 50s, a meticulous and deeply spiritual woman from Iloilo, began working in the palace in the late 1980s. Evelina is the expert in the palace's rhythms, knowing where every shadow falls and every door creaks. Evelina's encounters are more domestic and intimate. She frequently describes the strange phenomenon of objects being moved or misplaced, only to reappear moments later in the exact spot they were originally placed. Most notoriously, the photograph of a former president, a controversial figure, would be found consistently turned face down on a side table in the private library. Evelina would carefully turn it back up only to find it face down again hours later. Even when the room was sealed, she doesn't believe it's a living staff member playing a trick. She sees it as a spectral protest, a ghost from an opposing political faction or a wronged citizen, perpetually seeking to erase the memory of a leader they despised. For Evelina, it's not just a haunting, it's an ongoing political argument between the dead. These characters show that the haunting of Malacañang is not just a sensational story, but a complex, deeply personal experience for the people who serve it. Their faith and their cultural context provide a framework for interpreting events that science and psychology can only partially explain. The global feast and the empty plate. The tale of the empty chair and the ghosts of Malacañang Palace is, at its core, a story about the universal weight of power. Think of the lavish feasts held in that ceremonial hall, the crystal, the silver, the rich, exotic foods prepared by the best chefs, all served under the gaze of portraits of past leaders. These banquets were meant to project an image of success, stability, and national pride. Yet outside the palace walls, the story was often one of poverty, political turmoil, and widespread hardship. The empty chair, pulled back from the table, represents the national conscience that was often ignored. It is the invisible guest at every feast, the ghost of the common man, whose suffering makes the feast possible, but who is never invited to partake. This theme finds profound parallels internationally. The Palace of Versailles in France, for instance, became a symbol of royal decadence that ultimately led to revolution. The ghosts there are the hungry, the forgotten. The lavish meals and balls of the past leave a spiritual emptiness that the modern world can still sense. In Malacañang, the supernatural activity can be seen as the historical echo of this spiritual imbalance. The spectral man in the suit cannot rest because his life was consumed by the pursuit of power, and he left a debt unpaid to the nation he swore to serve. The weeping lady cannot cease her sorrow because her personal pain was rendered invisible by the grand theater of national politics. The child's cry is the sound of lost potential, the future the nation has continuously sacrificed. The story of the palace is not just about what was built there, but about what was taken: stolen wealth, lost innocence, betrayed trust. The hunting is the process by which the universe, or a deeply spiritual cultural consciousness, attempts to balance the scales of justice. The ghosts are the spiritual auditors of the nation's history, forever tallying the cost of power. A lingering question. As we step back from the Pasig River and the shadow of Malacañang, we are left with a powerful, unsettling question. If the seat of national power is spiritually compromised, haunted by the past sins of its rulers, what does that mean for the present and the future of the nation itself? If the ghosts of greed and oppression are perpetually sitting in council in the empty chair, can any living ruler truly govern with a clear conscience, or are they forever locked in a subtle, supernatural power struggle with the specters of those who came before? The stories of Malacañang are more than just ghost tales. They are a deep cultural meditation on authority, corruption, and the enduring Filipino belief that what happens in the shadows eventually leaves its mark on the light. If you are a true believer in the hidden, deeper forces at play and want to help us uncover more stories like this, access exclusive content on Patreon. Your support helps us dive deeper into the darkness. We'll be back soon to delve into another forgotten chapter of Filipino history and folklore. Until then, always remember to look closely at the shadows and listen to the whispers of the past. Thank you for listening to Stories Filipinos podcast. Like, subscribe, follow, and share this podcast to ensure these tales of the Philippines' dark heart reach more listeners. And please, consider supporting the podcast financially in ways you can find in the show notes. Is the empty chair truly empty, or is it merely waiting for the next ruler to join the council of the damned?